the thing to keep in mind is that everything, people often ask, how are we going to organize anybody? How are we going to change people? People are people don't know what's going on. People are locked into their beliefs. People are fixed in the way they think about these things. You have to understand that all of the axioms, and all the word axiom means is, for those who don't know, is just the underlying set of beliefs, or set of the mode in which you think, which determines how you think about things. And all of the axioms of the system are breaking down. I mean, you talk to people and they say, oh, free trade is a good thing. Oh, deregulation is a good thing. Oh, the global economy is a good thing. Oh, the IMF is a good thing. You talk to people and you get these, oh, the world economy is going fine. We've never had it so good. Or, these kind of things, everything people think about the economic system is breaking down. Not just, in terms of the man in the street, but at the highest level. And you'd be surprised how quickly people will change, and institutions will change, and governments will change. You could say, well, our government will never change. They're all a bunch of lackeys. They're all a bunch of cowards. How can you expect someone like Bill Clinton to implement LaRouche's policies? How can you expect these idiots in Congress to do what has to be done? You talk to these people, you talk to even, all kinds of organizations, and they seem to have fixed beliefs or a fixed approach to how to deal with these kind of problems, these kind of economic and financial and monetary problems. You're going to be amazed how quickly people are going to abandon what they believe in. When you reach a situation where the whole system is going, where everything is going, right, and it is clear that the policies that you have been locked into, the type of thinking that you have been locked into, no longer works, that it's not going to get you through this crisis, you're going to be amazed how fast people abandon those beliefs. Even if a month ago they were saying to you with absolute conviction that this free trade is the wave of the future, America has to support free trade, globalization is a fact of life, it's here to stay, we have to support it. You're going to, and I don't care if it's the President of the United States, members of Congress, heads of institutions, trade unions, or anything else, you're going to find out, you're going to see how quickly people will jettison those beliefs and be ready to adopt new policies. One day they'll be telling you globalization is great, we can't interfere with the freedom of the marketplace. The next day they're going to be calling for currency exchange controls, protective tariffs, and everything else. Because under these kind of conditions, at a point where it's clear that the policies you have followed aren't functioning and won't get you through this crisis, at that point you have to throw those policies overboard and find new policies. And that's going to happen very quickly. And you can see this, as I said, this statement by Rubin, I'm not telling you that Bill Clinton is going to come out tomorrow morning and say, we have to abolish the IMF and we have to adopt Lyndon LaRouche's new Bretton Woods, right? We're not there yet. We are not at that point yet. But, this is, in effect, a declaration of war on the IMF by the Clinton administration. It's unprecedented. And it says that the Clinton administration will not do what they did in the Mexican crisis today. They will not follow that path. They will not go with a global bailout to bail out the creditors, to bail out the George Soroses and these types. This means that that's not going to function. So something else has got to happen. So they're all meeting, trying to scramble, trying to figure out what to do. We would roll the debt over, refinance the loans, come up with some new schemes. There's all kinds of schemes they're coming up with. New funds that we're going to create. Like in Japan, they want to create this 78 or $82 billion fund to bail out some of the bad Japanese bank debt. I mean, $78 billion when the Japanese banks are holding over $1 trillion of bad loans. It's a drop in the bucket. It's idiotic. But they're going to come up with all kinds of schemes. But none of it's going to work. None of it's going to work. And the extent to which they even try it is just going to make the situation worse. But the fact that the Clinton administration has now, at least at this point, and we can't sit back and say, well, it's a fait accompli, because we have our job to do, our work to do. I mean, the Clinton administration could get cold feet and back down. But as of this point, the Clinton administration has, by saying that they're not going to go along with this kind of a global bailout, they're not going to go along with the IMF, means that as this crisis deepens, the Clinton administration has rejected that path. Therefore, the next thing, as the crisis deepens, the Clinton administration is going to have to figure out what it's going to do. What they've told the banks now is, these are your loans, these are, this is in the private sector, you guys are the ones who are owed the money, you have to figure out how to refinance the debt. Okay, that's good. But that, that's going to very quickly, it's going to become apparent very quickly that these banks can't do that they can't do it. So that then puts the ball back in the court of the Clinton administration. Okay, what then are you going to do? You've rejected the IMF approach, and the banks are incapable of solving the problem themselves. What then are you going to do? Right? So this is the situation we're in right now. It is changing very quickly, and the crisis is, I mean, look, South Korea is a bottomless pit. It doesn't matter how much money they throw at it. It's irrelevant. It's a bottomless pit, and it's impacting Japan. So what is going to happen between now and our national conference in 2 weeks, starts 2 weeks from today, or it starts 2 weeks from tomorrow, is a much greater intensification of this whole situation. Now this brings me to the main topic of the presentation, which is on LaRouche's paper on H.G. Wells, or the Wells of Doom. It's not on H.G. Wells itself, I mean, per se. But if you've been reading Lynn's material, you might remember that one of the things that he has said, that he has maintained, is that this is a crisis where, we can't go back to the 1950s or 60s. We can't go back to those days. In other words, sometimes people will say, okay, you were saying that the Bretton Woods system more or less functioned after 1946. That we more or less had a stable world monetary system. And obviously in this country we did have economic growth. In the middle of the 1960s there were problems in the country, but we had a growing, productive economy in 61, 62, 63, 64. We had clearly some good things going on, and then the policies changed. And, things broke down, particularly after 71, 72, 73, 74. So, why can't we go back to doing what we were doing in the 1950s and 60s? Why can't we just return to that, right? And that is one of the things that is at the core of this paper by Lynn. Because what he makes clear in this paper is that there is no basis to go back to that. That we are in a much different kind of crisis today. Now, what I want to do is is just kind of go through a little bit of what's in this article. The just one second. Well, let me start this way. I mean, everyone here has heard of H.G. Wells. You know, he's generally known as a science fiction writer. You know, he wrote The War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, and all of these type of things. He was not a science fiction writer. He was a lackey for the British oligarchy. He was not born to the aristocracy, but he was picked up. At a certain point, some people, much more powerful people, recognized in him certain qualities which could be used by the oligarchy, right? Kind of like Henry Kissinger, right? You know, Kissinger is not an oligarch. Kissinger is not the head of anything. Kissinger is, in and of himself, not a particularly powerful or important person. Kissinger is someone who went through a track. In his case, through Harvard, under William Randall, or whatever the guy's name is.
Yandell Elliott.
Yandell Elliott, or whatever the guy's name was. And he was on a track, and it's, you know, at a certain point, there were certain qualities in Kissinger that were recognized by much more powerful people as qualities that could be used. That this is a guy who could be trained, developed, could be kind of brought along to become a, you know, relatively important operative, political operative in the interests of the, you know, the Anglo-American oligarchy. And that's basically what H.G. Wells is. You know, he's a flunky who performed a certain kind of role. Now, he began publishing books in the 1890s, which put forward a certain kind of scenario, a certain view of humanity. And then in 1901, he published a book called Anticipations. It actually has a much longer name, which it's not really important what the name of it is. I forget the name of it. It's here somewhere, but it's generally known by the name Anticipations. This was published in 1901. And in this book, Wells lays out a scenario. But before I get into that, it's worth, you know, first, it's important to situate what the world looked like in 1901. And I would ask people, the extent to which you're familiar with the history of that period, is, you know, to try to put yourself in that period. Think of yourself as, you know, existing in that era and what was going on in the world. And particularly to try to view the world in that period from the standpoint of the British oligarchy. You know, how they viewed what was going on in the world. I mean, what's the period? Well, you had the British Empire, right? In the 1890s, Victoria was still the Queen of England. She had been the Queen for about 50 years. I mean, this is the height of the British Empire. You know, colonial India, Gunga Din, all that nonsense, you know. I mean, you know, this is the peak of the British Empire. Cecil Rhodes, everything like that, right? The sun never sets. The British Empire is ruling the world. But there's a danger, not a little danger, a mortal danger to the British Empire. And the danger is right here. It's the United States. Because what had happened is that the British had been unsuccessful in destroying the United States in the Civil War. The Confederacy was nothing but a creation of the British Empire, and we actually published a book on this called Treason in America by Anton Chaikin on the creation of the Confederacy. The British created the Confederacy, and they used the Confederacy to try to destroy the United States. they failed. They did succeed in assassinating Lincoln, but despite the assassination of Lincoln, Lincoln's policies continued. Maybe not as in, you know, as well as they would have under Lincoln, but his policies continued. Why don't you just get a chair? Alfred, why don't you just sit on a chair? Instead of blocking the, yeah, there's plenty of chairs. So the policies continued. Now look, what's the issue here? This is important. This is important for this whole thing. What is the issue? The issue is that from the very beginning of this country, the oligarchy has recognized in the United States the ideas, the only ideas in the world, really, which represent a mortal danger to the oligarchy. Ideas which, if fully developed and fully implemented, would mean the end of the oligarchy. It would mean that the oligarchy would no longer exist. Now, what are the ideas of the American Revolution? You have the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. All men created equal. Now, today, you know, we take that for granted. Put yourself in 1776. All men created equal. This is not an idea which was generally accepted in the world in 1776. Look at all the countries of the world. Kings, queens, you know, big landowners, you know, with serfs, with slaves, you know. The world was run by a handful, less than a handful, a tiny number of people, of oligarchs. And the vast majority of people were just simply cattle. That's all. All men created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This is an unprecedented idea, that every single person in the world has inalienable rights, that is, rights which are God-given, which no oligarch, no king, no power can take away, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you look at the Constitution, you know, and the ideas, particularly in the preamble. See, people have this weird idea about the Constitution, that the Constitution is some kind of Bible, like a fundamentalist tract, you know, it's in the Constitution. Look, the important part of the Constitution is the preamble. That's the important part of the Constitution, because the preamble gives you the intent of the Constitution. In other words, the preamble is not just some kind of little thing stuck on, you know, which kind of is, you know, like a little, you know, introduction. The preamble tells you what the Constitution is all about. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right? And I don't know the preamble by heart, but the common defense, the general welfare of the population, right? Like, it's not worth going through it right now. This tells you what the Constitution is, and all the rest of it, Article 1, Article 2, that's just the implementation. That's all it is. It's just the implementation of the ideas that are in the preamble. The preamble tells you what the Constitution is all about, right? You know, and then the rest of it just sets up structures, you know, which are not that important, except that the structures are set up in such a way as to try to be coherent with the ideas that are in the preamble. But again, a government which provides for the common welfare. The idea that a government, or as Lincoln put it later in the Gettysburg Address, of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? The common welfare. These are ideas which are alien to any society that had ever existed in history, period, in the United States. Now, it didn't just spring out of nowhere in 1776. There's a history to it going back, you know, a long time, you know, to the Renaissance and prior to that. But the point is, the United States was the first nation state established on these principles, consciously on these principles, constitutionally on these principles. And the British recognized right away that this wasn't simply, it wasn't as if they were losing a colony in 1776, and they were going to, try to, keep their colony like they wanted to keep India after World War II. That's just nonsense. They recognized in the United States a new type of society, a new type of government, which was anathema to everything the oligarchy stood for. And they tried to destroy it. And then they invaded again in 1812 and burned our capital and tried to reconquer us then. And then they launched the Confederacy and tried to reconquer us and destroy us in the Civil War. Because they knew that this nation and the ideas inherent in this nation represented a mortal threat to the British Empire itself. So what happened? The victory of the Union in the Civil War and the economic policies of the Lincoln administration, the American system policies of the Lincoln administration, brought about the greatest industrial and scientific revolution in human history. In the United States, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, you had the emergence of a scientific and industrial superpower, the likes of which the world had never seen before. Now, not only was this going on in the United States, but we began to export this. Not export, goods. We were doing that, but this method, the American system of economics, we began to export that to other countries. And they began to imitate what was going on here. In Russia, in Japan, in China, in Germany, in South America. They began putting up protective tariffs, setting up national banks, building infrastructure, investing in science and technology. They began, Republican economic policies. They began to replicate what the United States had been doing. Russia, they built the Transcontinental Railroad. Germany was building the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. Japan went from feudalism to a modern industrial economy in one generation. Literally. I mean, in 1850, Japan had a society which was no different than the 12th century in Europe. Feudalist. Literally. You might as well have been in France in 1150 to be in Japan in 1850. 50 years later, they were a major industrial power in the world, and they defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. All right? This is what was going on. And what the British recognized is that if this continued, that the days of the British Empire were numbered. The days of the British oligarchical system were numbered. That the American system was spreading all over the world. And by the 1880s to 90s, this had become a pressing issue for the British oligarchy. Very pressing. So they decided they had to stop it. Now, one of the things they did, which is not the subject of the discussion tonight, is they organized, excuse me, they organized World War I. And I'm not going to go into that. But they organized World War I particularly for the purpose of destroying Germany and Russia and preventing the construction of the Eurasian land bridge. But at the same time that they organized World War I, what they were thinking about is getting rid of the root of the problem. How to get rid of this American virus of republicanism, of economic nationalism. How to rid the world of it forever, once and for all. And that's what H.G. Wells' writings are all about. This is what they were thinking about at the turn of the century. And in fact, the same year that Wells published Anticipation, 1901, was the year that the last American president who was consciously a Lincoln Republican, was assassinated. McKinley was assassinated in 1901. McKinley was a Lincoln Republican. That is, he didn't just, call himself a Lincoln Republican. He was a Lincoln Republican. I mean, McKinley, I'm not sure if he was a World War II, a Civil War, was he a Civil War veteran?
Yeah.
He was a Civil War veteran, and he had come up through the 1860s and 70s and 80s in the Lincoln Kerry branch of the Republican Party. He was consciously a Lincoln Republican, an economic nationalist, a follower of Henry Carey's American system of economics, right? He was assassinated in 1901, and in that same year, Wells published Anticipations. Now, what does Wells say in Anticipations? What he says is that Wells hates the United States. And what he says is that the big problem in the world is nationalism. Sovereign nations. Sovereign nations cause wars, sovereign nations cause all kinds of problems. And we have to figure out a way to solve this problem, to get rid of sovereign nations. And what he's really talking about is the United States, the threat from the United States. So he develops a three-part scenario. Number one, the development of weapons of mass destruction so powerful and so awesome, so terrifying in their destructive capacity, that countries can be blackmailed into surrendering their sovereignty and their political institutions, or even their philosophy of government. Number two, the establishment of a world government to replace these sovereign nations. And number three, the imposition of global zero growth to prevent any more progress. You know, this dangerous thing that was unleashed by the American Revolution. He doesn't call it zero growth. He calls it neo-Malthusianism, which he uses that term after Parson Malthus. The establishment of global neo-Malthusianism, that is putting an end to human progress and science. And combined with that, the unleashing of sexual freedom. That is, the loosening of sexual morals. So that through sexual freedom, sexual recreation, you have a means of keeping the population happy and docile so that people will not object to the loss of their national sovereignty, the establishment of a world government, an end to scientific progress, the imposition of a zero-growth society. People will not object to any of this because the establishment of sexual freedom will keep them preoccupied with those kind of pleasures. This is what he lays out in this book, Anticipations, in 1901. This article of the EIR, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this article of the EIR has, fairly extensive quotes from this. I'll read you a couple of quotes. Then in 1913, Wells actually refined this scenario a little bit. He published another book in 1913 called what was it called? I've got it here somewhere. The World Set Free. He published The World Set Free in 1913, which was a novel in which he lays out this scenario. It's fiction. Only in this book, it's the same exact scenario as he had written in 1901. But in this book, in 1913, he actually refines the idea of weapons of mass destruction by talking about atomic weapons and nuclear war. This is 1913. This is before the outbreak of World War I, when Wells lays out this plan that countries can be forced to abandon their national sovereignty, can be blackmailed into that through the threat of nuclear annihilation. Right? So now I'm going to give you some quotes on all this and then just kind of follow this through a little bit. But I just want you to just take a second here and reflect on this scenario that Wells lays out from the standpoint of what we discussed here 2 weeks ago. What I went through in terms of the post-war generation, the so-called baby boomer generation, the children of the World War II veterans and others, the ones that have come since then. Because the scenario that Wells laid out in 1901 and 1913 is exactly what this country went through in the 1960s and 70s. And it was the baby boomer generation which was terrified and brainwashed into accepting this scenario. Not just accepting it, but even welcoming it, you know, as a good thing. And that's what we've been living through over the course of the past 20 to 30 years. And if you think of where we are today, this scenario laid out by Wells, the threat of nuclear weapons, you know, the nuclear terror, terrifying people so much that they would agree to give up their sovereignty. Well, think back to the timeline I put up last week and the question of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. What happened then? When we came to the very brink of nuclear war, when many people thought that a war was going to happen within days or hours, and the terror of that. And think about what followed that, right? What followed that? Well, Kennedy was dead less than a year later. But then what did we get? Détente, arms control. Now, there may be some people here who think that détente, friendship with the Russians, was a good thing. That arms control was a good thing. Well, if you think that way, you've been duped. This had nothing to do with, you know, trying to be friendly with the Russians. I mean, look, the Russians gave up communism after the Berlin Wall came down and said, we want to be your friends. And what did we do to them? We sent in the IMF and Jeffrey Sachs, and basically, you know, have driven them to the brink of total disaster, over the brink, into disaster, to the point of disintegration of their society. This had nothing to do with it. What it had to do with was setting up a whole arms control scenario, which increasingly would be coordinated and run by globalist supranational institutions. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But that's what happened, you know, in terms of the arms control thing. You know, you had the peace movement and all of this stuff, you know. The end of science, you know, putting an end to scientific and technological progress. We went through this in the timeline last week. The launching of the environmentalist movement, the China syndrome, you know, the 3 Mile Island, you know, the founding of the World Wildlife Fund, and groups like Greenpeace, and all of this. You know, love the whales, love the seals, you know, love the trees, love the spotted owls, all of this stuff. Aimed at putting an end to science, putting an end to technological progress, a zero-growth society, depopulation. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, a book widely read on college campuses during the last 20 to 30 years. Right? This is what people have been brainwashed to, a zero-growth, neo-Malthusian society. People starving in Africa, well, Africa's overpopulated. They really, you know, should have birth control. AIDS, well, it's a natural form of birth control for Africa. You get this for people today. You know, not everyone, but it's not uncommon to get that kind of thinking. Sexual freedom, well, I don't think anybody's going to argue with the fact that there's been a loosening of sexual morals in this country in the last 30 years. A loosening is perhaps, how about an abolition of sexual morals in this country in the last 30 years. People really are, you know, have very little. Mostly what holds people back from being more degenerate sexually than they actually are is the afraid that they'll get caught. It's not even disease, you know, but that, you know, they'll get caught, and this could cause them, their wife to be mad at them, or their husband, or, you know, or their children, or something bad could happen to them. But baby boomers, really, from a moral standpoint, don't have much in the way of sexual morals left. It's mostly a practical standpoint that restrains them a little bit. You know, obviously, where are we today? You look at the crisis that I described at the beginning of the meeting. This system is going very quickly. Now, is the oligarchy just going to sit back and let it go? Is the City of London going to sit back and let it go? Rio Tinto Zinc and, you know, and the Bank of London and Morgan Grenfell and J.P. Morgan and Citibank and all of these people, are they just going to sit back and let it go? No, they have a plan. They have their own plan. Their plan is what H.G. Wells wrote in 1901. Right? They intend to survive this crisis by finishing off the last vestiges of national sovereignty. Totally eradicating national sovereignty. And imposing an IMF dictatorship. And the IMF is just a tool. The IMF is not the oligarchy. It's a tool of the oligarchy. Imposing an IMF dictatorship over every country in the world. Debt collection, squeezing money out of countries, squeezing blood out of a stone, whatever they have to do. Whatever will keep them afloat. Zero growth, Malthusianism. Meanwhile, they'll, you know, you can have all the internet porn you want. You can legalize gambling in every state in the United States. You know, any form of, you know, hedonistic pleasure can be legalized in the name of freedom of expression. The government doesn't have the right to interfere with me and my body. Anything my body has the urge to do, government better keep their hands off. You know, so you know, all the hedonistic, you know, things people want will be there to keep people preoccupied. But meanwhile, you know, the oligarchy intends to use this crisis to impose the final stages of the Wells scenario. That is why we can't go back to 1957. There is no going back. The way that Lynn and LaRouche has described this is that we have been in a balance of power in the world. Not the balance of power that, you know, can you turn that heat off, Robert? Yeah. Not the balance of power that people have come to accept in the, you know, come to think of in terms of the Cold War, but a balance of power going back 500 years to the Renaissance. That in the Renaissance, you had the creation of the modern sovereign nation. Now, most people don't know anything about this. They think of the Renaissance as, you know, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, cathedrals, things like this, which is all a crucial part of the Renaissance. But if you look at the art of the Renaissance, the art and the music of the Renaissance, what you have there, which didn't exist before, I mean, anyone who really wants to think about this, I mean, you don't have to be a great, you know, intellectual. You really don't. You don't have to, you know, go to Stanford University or anything. In fact, that would be probably detrimental to you. But go find a book in a library on the history of art.
They've been burnt.
And not yet. The history of art. And look at the paintings, because they did paint, you know. Look at the paintings from 1100, 1200, 1300, and then look at the paintings in the Renaissance. It is startling. Startling. And it's not just because they had better paint, you know, new qualities of paint. There's a different conception of what it means to be a human being. An entirely different conception. This idea of man made in the image of God, the idea of man as a creature of reason, not an animal, not some serf living like a donkey out in the field, but the spark of reason in each person. This is what you find in Renaissance art, which did not exist prior to that in European culture in that way. So you had this idea in the Renaissance, the celebration of man's creative capabilities. And out of that, and this is, you know, this is a nutshell, but out of that, you know, you had the development of the first modern sovereign nation, France. Nations did not exist in 1200. Look at a map. Read a history book. There were no countries, there were no nations in 1200. I mean, there may have been something on a map that looked like France, but there was no central government. It was all run by these duchies and lords and everything. Feudalism. France established a modern nation. And it was not just a nation of a king, but the idea was, and you can go back, and this is where the idea of the Commonwealth come from. Does anybody know what Commonwealth, where the name Commonwealth comes from? It comes from a term called commonweal. And weal means good. So it's not just commonwealth, like money, right? Commonwealth comes from commonweal, and weal means good. And the idea of the Commonwealth was you establish a nation based on the common good, right? Like the general welfare. So the nation is for the common good. And it was actually in France in the late 1400s where you had the first public schools. You had the first use of taxation by the central government to build infrastructure. You had the idea that the government, and it was limited, but you had the idea that the government had an obligation to use its powers to uplift the general population, to improve the conditions of life of not just the oligarchs, but everyone, right? And what we've had for 500 years is basically two systems in the world. We've had the oligarchy. You know, both the old landed aristocracy and oligarchy, like in Russia that Chekhov writes about, you know, or you have the, or you have in some of these third world countries, you know, the latifundists, or more modernly, the financial oligarchy, you know, the bankers and the financial oligarchy. You have the oligarchy and their oligarchical views. But also, ever since the Renaissance, you have had a republican tradition. The idea of the creation of a sovereign republican nation states based on a different concept of man. A concept of man, you know, a concept of a nation in which the capabilities of each newborn infant the government has made a pledge to the citizens of that country to use its powers to the utmost of its ability to help foster and develop the capabilities of each newborn infant. Right? Like in America, where every child every child could grow up to be president. Right? That's what they used to say, right? People used to say. You know, every child has these kind of capabilities, right? The idea where each human person is important. You've had these two conflicting systems in the world for 500 years. The American Revolution was the biggest defeat to the oligarchy they've ever suffered politically, ever. But you have a situation today where two things have happened. First of all, the baby boomer generation has thrown away its commitment to the very things which make the continued existence of a republican nation state possible. Sovereign nations, oh no, it's one world. We are the world, you know, planetary consciousness, you know. That the baby boomer generation has thrown away its commitment. Sovereign nation, scientific and technological progress, these types of things. You know, that we have a generation today which is increasingly the generation in power, which no longer has any commitment to the very things which made the United States possible as a sovereign nation, as a republican nation. Lincoln's America. If you really understand what Lincoln's America is all about, our greatest president, and look at the baby boomer generation, they have essentially abandoned the principles that Lincoln America stood on. But secondly, as I was saying, you have a situation today where the we've reached a point where the oligarchy is very close to the establishment of the scenario that Wells laid out in 1901. We are very close to that. If you just look at what he's talking about, we are almost at that point. And that is clearly what the oligarchy wants to, that is clearly their mindset in this crisis. Now, at this point in time, we can't just say, oh, well, look, let's have a little reform of the IMF. Oh, well, let's have a little reform of the Federal Reserve. Let's increase the minimum wage by $1 an hour. I mean, that's a good idea. You know, people should make $1 an hour more. But the point is that we're at a breakdown of the entire world global financial system. And there is no way we are going to survive this crisis by trying to cut a deal with the oligarchy, by trying to put through some reforms of this system. It's not going to work. The only way we're going to get through this crisis is if we break the power of the oligarchy on this planet. If we eliminate it. If we reimpose a Bretton Woods system, but this time based on national banking, not central banking. We break the power of private finance, because that's what you've had. If you want to understand in a nutshell what I'm talking about, there's these two systems that have coexisted. Sovereign nations, the power of sovereign governance over affairs, but existing simultaneously with private banking. Private central banking, in which you not only have privately owned banks, but private central banking like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, in which these private central banks run the monetary affairs of these countries. That has got to change. We've got to eliminate private central banking, and we've got to have we've got to break the financial power of the oligarchy. The financial aristocracy, the financial oligarchy has to be broken permanently, forever. If we don't do that, we're not going to get through this crisis. There's no halfway measures. There's no, reforms. So, let me just run through a little bit of this very quickly in terms of the Wells scenario, just to give you a sense of it, because people may think I'm exaggerating or something. So Wells wrote this book in 1913. Called the
World Set Free.
What? The World Set Free, right. I keep forgetting the name of it. In which he talks about atomic bombs. Now, how did Wells know about atomic bombs in 1913? Well, he had been in touch with a guy named Frederick Soddy, S-O-D-D-Y. Soddy was a scientist, a physicist, and Soddy had been working with a guy named Ernest Rutherford. Some people may have heard of Soddy or Rutherford. They're fairly well known, particularly Rutherford. Rutherford actually published the first paper ever published on nuclear research. This is before the Curies, Madame Curie and all this stuff. This is before them. He published the first work ever published. He published it in 1909, and it was called. Actually, Soddy published this. Soddy published this paper. Based on lectures given by Rutherford. Soddy had attended a whole series of lectures that Rutherford had given And based on those lectures, in 1909 he published something called The Interpretation of Radium and the Structure of the Atom. And what he talked about in that paper, and what Rutherford had talked about in his lectures in 1908, was that based on his study of the atom, it was clear to him that the atom had certain properties which could make it a source of energy. And because of the way that worked, that the atom might, number one, be a source of a type of energy much different and much greater than anybody had ever seen before. But secondly, that the possibility also exists that this energy of the atom could be unleashed in the form of an explosive device, that is a bomb, right? And this is what Rutherford lays out in 1908 and 1909, and Soddy publishes. And Soddy was writing letters and was in communication with Wells, and basically Wells got a hold of all of this stuff, and based on that he reworked his scenario from 1901 from Anticipations, and based this on nuclear weapons, The World Set Free in 1913. And just to give you a sense of it, this is a novel, The World Set Free, as are a lot of Wells's books. And if you look at all of Wells's books down through the 1920s and 30s, it's all the same theme, just reworked in a different way. But basically it's all the same theme. He set out the theme in 1901 in Anticipations. And all his subsequent books just reworked this. He died in 1946, Wells did. For instance, in this book, The World Set Free, there's a nuclear war. A nuclear war happens. And at the end of the war, you know, the total destruction. And what Wells says in the book, in describing the after effects of this nuclear war, he says, "The catastrophe of the atomic bombs, which shook men out of cities and businesses and economic relations, shook them also out of their old established habits of thought and out of the lightly held beliefs and prejudices that came down to them from the past. They were released from old ties. For good or evil, they were ready for new associations." Right? That's the scenario. Nuclear war breaks down all of the existing political structures and opens man up for new associations, for a one-world government. Right? Now, what happened after the First World War is that Wells and some of his collaborators, including people like Leo Szilard, who was a scientist, and Bertrand Russell and Eugene Wigner, began to work on this idea of the development of nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't develop nuclear weapons to stop Germany or stop Japan or anything else. Their push for the development of nuclear weapons was to implement this scenario laid out by H.G. Wells. Right? To use nuclear weapons to bring about an end to sovereign countries and an end to the virus of Americanism, American republicanism, to eliminate that from the world. So they started working on this throughout the 1920s. Now, after Hitler came to power, you know, they developed the idea that they could get either the United States or Great Britain to develop nuclear weapons based on a threat from Hitler. And they went to Albert Einstein. And they got Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, basically saying that the Germans are working on nuclear weapons, and we think, you know, I'm proposing to you that we start a project to build, you know, such weapons for the United States in order to meet the threat from Nazi Germany. Now, this was the beginnings of the Manhattan Project, right? And in fact, the letter, I'm not going to read it to you, but the letter that Einstein wrote to Franklin Roosevelt, it was written August 2nd, 1939. The entire letter is printed verbatim in this article. And this is the letter that Einstein sent to FDR, which resulted in FDR setting up the Manhattan Project. Now, most people think that the Manhattan Project was set up because of the threat that Germany was going to build nuclear weapons. That's not true. That is simply not true. Einstein was, what happened is that Bertrand Russell and Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner and Wells went to Einstein, and they told Einstein that they had evidence that the Nazis were working on nuclear weapons. They had no such evidence. None. Right? But they knew that Einstein, who was the most prestigious scientist in the world, that Einstein would carry weight with the White House. That if he said that this was what was going on, the White House would listen. They also knew that Einstein, who was Jewish, was extremely concerned about what the Nazis were doing in Germany. So they basically manipulated Einstein to write this letter to Roosevelt. They had no evidence that the Germans were working on nuclear weapons. Regardless of that, they were not trying to get Roosevelt to develop nuclear weapons in order to stop Germany. They couldn't care less about Germany. They saw this as the culmination, the accomplishment of Wells's of the development of nuclear weapons as a key part of Wells's scenario laid out in 1901. So they pushed for this, and they got it. And as people know, we got nuclear weapons. And then when the nuclear bomb was finally developed, it was the Wells crowd, and the Bertrand Russell crowd, who pushed to use it, right? In 1945 against Japan. I mean, we had developed the weapon supposedly, this was the public relations, to stop Germany. Because Germany was building nuclear weapons and we had to beat them to this, or Germany would have would have nuclear weapons and they'd conquer the world. Nazism. Well, Japan didn't have nuclear weapons. They weren't even working on it. Everybody knew it. Germany was defeated. So why use the nuclear weapons against Japan? There was no threat of them developing nuclear weapons. Well, there's two arguments you hear for why we use the nuclear weapons against Japan. The established story, which is what all the history books say, is that Japan wouldn't surrender, and if we had not used nuclear weapons, we would have had to invade Japan, and America would have suffered 1 million casualties. That's what all the history books say. Of course, that's not true, because we have printed in the EIR extensive research on this, including documents proving that the Japanese emperor, in the weeks before the bombing of Hiroshima, was in negotiations with the United States in Rome for unconditional surrender. And at the point that the bombing, unconditional surrender, and at the point that the bombing occurred, the Japanese were days away from agreeing to unconditional surrender, the personal emissary from Emperor Hirohito. And this has been well documented. But that's the established story, that we had to use the bomb to prevent American casualties with an invasion of Japan. Then you hear from some people that particularly from kind of leftists and pseudo-Marxists, college campus type, pseudo-Marxists, is that we use the bomb not really against Japan but against Russia. That this was some people may have heard this, maybe not, but it's not an uncommon theory. That we use the bomb against Russia, against Japan, basically to send a message to Russia, right? That if we were going to to let Russia know that we had such devastating military capabilities that they better play ball after the war. This is that this was essentially a threat to Russia to agree to American demands after the war, or they might get this treatment. They might get nuked, right? So that's another theory. But in fact, the people who pushed the hardest for the use of the nuclear bombs in Japan were the Wells-Russell crowd, Bertrand Russell, right? There was actually a meeting in the White House with Harry Truman, and over whether or not the bomb should be dropped. This is a very famous meeting, and the different people presented different arguments. Now, Edward Teller, who has generally gone down in the history books as kind of a right-winger, father of the H-bomb, Teller was at that meeting. And Teller said we shouldn't use it. The weapon is too terrible. We should not use it. If we're going to use it, we should drop it on a deserted island and bring some Japanese government officials in and let them see it, right, as a demonstration of what we can do, right? The military wasn't so sure we should use it. The War Department, they didn't argue for it very strongly. You know, then you would think they would want to save American lives from an invasion of Japan. The person who argued the strongest for the use of the nuclear bomb at this meeting in the White House was Oppenheimer, the man who was basically the coordinator of the Manhattan Project. Now, Oppenheimer was an operative in the H.G. Wells Bertrand Russell crowd, who later went on to become a leader in the peace movement, as did Bertrand Russell, right? But it was Oppenheimer who argued for the use of the bomb against Japan. And, you know, apparently Truman listened to him because the bomb was dropped, right? Now, Bertrand Russell, who was, you know, collaborators of Wells, a cohort of Wells, let me read you a quote from him. The 2 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, 2 days after Nagasaki was bombed, Bertrand Russell wrote an article in which he said, now this is after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, August 11th, 1945. The prospect for the human race is somber beyond all precedent. Mankind are faced with a clear-cut alternative. Either we shall all perish, or we shall have to acquire some slight degree of common sense. Either war or civilization must end. And if it is to be war that ends, there must be an international authority with the sole power to make new atomic bombs. All supplies of uranium must be placed under the control of the international authority, which shall have the right to safeguard the ore by armed forces. As soon as such an authority has been created, all existing bombs and all plants for their manufacture must be handed over. And of course, the international authority must have sufficient armed forces to protect whatever has been handed over, of course. Sufficient armed forces to protect what has been handed over to it. If this system were once established, the international authority would be irresistible and wars would cease. All right, this is 2 days after the bombing of Nagasaki he wrote this. Now, get the picture here, folks. You know, Russell is working with Wells from the turn of the century onward. I mean, you know, Russell lived to be like 95. I mean, this guy was already, you know, wrote Principia Mathematica in like 1900. I mean, this guy had a long career. He's working with Wells at the turn of the century. He was a member of the British Coefficients with Wells, a member of the British Fabian Society with Wells. They are working on this scenario together. Russell played a key role in getting Einstein to develop the nuclear bomb, to write the letter to Roosevelt for the Manhattan Project, right? So Russell is pushing for the development of the nuclear bomb during this whole period. Then, as soon as the bomb is used, 2 days after Nagasaki, he says, you know, either war or civilization must end, and if it is to be war that ends, there must be an international authority with the sole power to make the new bombs. And they must have all the bombs, all the countries who have bombs must turn them over to this international authority, and they must have an army to protect these bombs, and they must have sufficient armed forces, blah, blah, blah. And if you think that maybe that's just a slip of the tongue, a year later in 1946, Russell wrote in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, quote, "There is only one way in which great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed force. When I speak of an international government, I mean one that really governs. An international government, if it is to be able to preserve peace, must have the only atomic bombs, the only plant for producing those bombs, the only air force, the only battleships and its infantry regiments must be made up of countries from different nations, but loyal only to the international authority. There must be no possibility of the development of national feeling in any unit or company. So this is, he says, every member of the International Armed Force should be carefully trained in loyalty to the international government. So this is in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1946. So, you know, I'm not making this up. You know, when you look at what Wells wrote in 1901 and his scenario of the development of weapons so horrible that countries could be blackmailed to surrender their sovereignty, that a world government could be established. You look at the push for the development of the bomb, the role of Russell in this, and then as soon as the bombs are exploded, this call by Russell for a world government and for the control over nuclear weapons, which is what they tried, for those of you who may be old enough to remember, something called the Baruch Plan, which I won't go into too much detail, right? I won't go into it at all. But the Baruch Plan at the end of World War II, Bernard Baruch's plan for the internationalization and control over all nuclear weapons and all nuclear energy, right? Which was part of the Wells scenario, part of the Wells-Russell thing. It was a very evil idea that Baruch put forward at that time. But so this is the scenario, and then if you follow it out through the 1950s and 60s, this is what they worked on. In the beginning of the 1950s, or in the middle of the 1950s, they set up something called Pugwash, the Pugwash Conference, which was set up by Bertrand Russell and a guy named Leo Szilard. Szilard had also played a key role in getting Einstein, maybe probably it was probably Szilard who played the most important role in getting Einstein to write the letter to FDR. Now, Leo Szilard is not a household name, but he was a very important guy. If anyone here has ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, the figure Dr. Strangelove in the movie, the guy played by Peter Sellers, was actually modeled on Leo Szilard. And the director, Stanley Kramer, said that in an interview, a magazine interview. Szilard was a real nutcase, and Szilard, he actually wrote a book. What was the theme of the movie Dr. Strangelove? How I Learned to Love the Bomb or something? Yeah. Well, Szilard wrote a book in 1960 called How to Live with the Bomb and Survive, you know? But anyway, Szilard in the mid-50s created something called, with Bertrand Russell, called the Pugwash Conference. And these guys began the process of pushing for arms control. Russell founded the Ban the Bomb movement, right? Russell, who had been pushing for the building of the bomb, and who had argued for the bombing of Japan with the nuclear bombs, turns around and starts the Ban the Bomb movement. And they begin this whole international disarmament movement, with Russell and Szilard in the leading role. They roped in the Russians. They began to kind of cozy up to Khrushchev at that time, and what have you. And it's all in the article, so I'm not going to go through it because it's getting a little bit late. But anyway, the real breaking point was the Cuban Missile Crisis. They had been pushing before then. Kennedy actually had signed one treaty, which was the Test Ban Treaty, which he actually is known, it's written in a number of his biographies, that he was not too thrilled with this treaty. He almost didn't sign it. But he signed one treaty, the Test Ban Treaty. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought us to the brink of war, coming out of that, you know, everything, you know, the whole Wells scenario, the disarmament movement went into full gear. With Kennedy dead, Johnson in, you had the unleashing of détente by 1965-66, and the whole arms control movement. And as Lou mentioned later on, you know, SALT I, SALT II, all of this stuff, right? And you could say, well, isn't disarmament a good thing? I mean, you know, nuclear weapons are horrible. Isn't disarmament a good thing? Well, first of all, two things to keep in mind. Weapons never started a war, and disarmament never stopped a war. Never, in history. Never happened, right? If you disagree with that statement, speak up and give me an example. It's never happened, right? in history. The World War I did not start because of an arms race. World War I started because of the British efforts to destroy Germany and Russia and save its empire. And you know, you could go back into all of these things. Disarmament never stopped a war, and weapons never started a war. But secondly, if you look at this disarmament process, what you had was a situation in which, first of all, not only weapons are being targeted, but science, nuclear science, other science. You look at the SDI program, the work in nonlinear, particle beam, laser, nonlinear physics. The frontiers of science is being targeted here. At the same time, what you had developing, beginning with Pugwash, and then this kind of just snowballed down through the 60s and 70s, was kind of the creation and development of an arms control mafia, right? Paul Nietzsche and Kissinger and all these people. And, which increasingly began to work through internationalist institutions, like the United Nations and other institutions, in which basically the question over what kinds of arms, what kind of weapons, what kind of agreements that could be made, is sort of taken out of the hands of governments. And you have the signing of treaties in which international agencies will have the power to enforce on governments what kind of weapons you could have or not have, right? And then with the reorganization of the United Nations under George Bush and John Major, when Boutros Ghali was brought in under the reorganized United Nations, you had the development of the UN Army, which they had big plans for. If you think about what Russell's talking about in 1946, the development of the UN Army, which had not existed prior to that. Look, in the Korean War, yes, it was a UN effort, but every part of that army in the Korean War was under the command. I mean, you had nominally a commander-in-chief, but nobody swore allegiance to the United Nations, And that's the way the UN functioned, in which countries contributed armed forces. But with the reorganization of the UN under Boutros Ghali, you had the establishment of a UN Army. And they had big plans for that, and it would probably be a lot more advanced than it is right now, except that Clinton pulled the plug on it in Bosnia. If you recall, when he when he sent the U.S. jets in to bomb the Serbs during the Croatian offensive, he basically just totally stepped, he overrode.
Unilateral.
He took unilateral action. I mean, the rules in Bosnia were that the United States, that all military action had to be approved through the United Nations. And at a certain point, the United States played along and played along and played along. And at a certain point, when the Croatians started their offensive, the United States sent in, if you remember, those air raids, knocking out all these Croatian positions, or all these Serb positions. And that was done unilaterally by Clinton. And the efforts to subject the United States military to the United Nations has suffered a big blow then, from which I don't think it's recovered. But this has been the scenario. This has been the scenario all along. The imposition of of this kind of scenario. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was not only used to launch this arms control movement, but as I went through in some detail last week, when I went through the whole timeline and the air raid shelters and all of this other stuff that was going on, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination, the war in Vietnam, basically to terrorize a adolescent population with the idea that the world, that they may not live to see their adulthood, that the world was a horrible, dangerous place, that they could be dead at any moment, and to terrorize them on the one hand into accepting these kind of changes, this Wells scenario, for an end to progress, an end to science, an end to national sovereignty. But on the other hand, to terrorize people into the idea that the world is too horrible and terrible of a place to even think about in terms of the larger problems in the world, and to offer instead, you know, the erotic paradise, the sexual freedom, the drugs, and everything else that was unleashed in the 60s, you know? And that's what occurred. That's what occurred. And we are at the point right now where it's really an endgame kind of scenario, because either we have to, in this crisis, if you really look at it, think it through, think through where we are. Either the Republican nation state and the ideas of the American Constitution, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, the ideas of Lincoln's America, of what's in the Gettysburg Address, either those institutions and those ideas will not survive this crisis, or the oligarchy will not survive this crisis. One or the other is going to go. And that's where we're at right now. That is where we are at in history. You know? And that's the challenge. That's the issue of Lynn's leadership and rallying around that leadership. So I'm going to pretty much wind it up here. You know, people can read the article and read the material. But I did want to read just one more thing. Last week, I believe I read it, or 2 weeks ago, I read the quote from Kennedy's speech in Rice University on the space program. Well, I have another quote from Kennedy. So we'll conclude both of these presentations with a quote from John F. Kennedy. Now, this is from his inaugural address, and this is better known than the speech at Rice University. But, you know, this is, you know, it's nevertheless, it's appropriate. And I'm just going to read a short excerpt from his inaugural address. In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease. Will you join in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. So, I like the part in particular where he says, I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. And, you know, that's the issue today. I mean, you know, just in conclusion, on this issue of the question of the cultural paradigm shift, what Lynn is talking about in terms of the 1960s. You really have a disease. I mean, the way to think about the baby boomer generation is that it's a disease. There are certain qualities to that generation as a whole Now, obviously, you know, everyone's different. Different people are different than others. But as a whole, it is a morally unanchored generation. That's not the exact term I'm looking for, but unmoored maybe is a better term. Generation. Which has been terrified, which has been scared, which has been threatened with nuclear annihilation, which grew up in an America that was drifting under Eisenhower, threatened with war, and in the 1960s with the unleashing of the rock, drug, sex counterculture, you had the entire generation abandon truth, abandon the fight for truth in favor of day-to-day, you know, self-centered hedonism, self-centered, me generation pleasure. And this is a generation which we have to take on, because this is a generation which has abandoned that which created this country, the ideas which are created this country. You think about this, you know, this thing that Kennedy said, or what I read last week from the space program. Each generation, or what even Franklin Roosevelt made, not Franklin Roosevelt, Benjamin Franklin made this point at the time of the Constitutional Convention. Each generation is called upon. And this generation says, well, forget, not, I'll pass. I'll pass, you know. Let me see what's on cable TV tonight. I wonder if Seinfeld's doing anything interesting, you know. I mean, it's a joke. And, you know, we've got to, we have a situation right now where the Secretary Treasury of the United States just told the IMF, pardon my French, to go to hell. And to, that the United States is not going to bail out George Soros and his friends over South Korea. In a certain sense, they've crossed the Rubicon. Now, if things get kind of hot, you never know. Clinton might jump in the water and try to swim back, you know, and say, we didn't really mean it. But at least for the time being, you know, the United States has refused to play ball. And the situation is only going to heat up. So we've got to, you know, when people say to us, you know, I'm not interested in politics, you know, we have to realize, you know, you know, why they're not interested in
Ask
politics.
them if you'd like to find out why they're not interested in politics.
Why they're not interested in politics. You know, what was done to them, and the way in which they were, you know,
what did the Giants do last year?
Destroyed. So, you know, we live, as the Chinese say, we live in interesting times. And, you know, the Chinese curse is, what is the Chinese curse? May your descendants live in interesting times or something. But Lin says that LaRouche says he likes living in interesting times. You know, in Chinese, interesting times mean times of great turmoil and turbulence, you know. And that's where we're in. And making the world, you know, singing, you know, make the world go away. It ain't gonna go away, folks. It ain't gonna go away. You know, you can go listen to your Loretta Lynn records and whatever, but it's not going anywhere. You know, so we got a big job on our hands, and it's pretty exciting. And you know, a lot of people are listening to Lynn. A lot of people are listening to Lynn. One more thing. I'll just conclude with this. To give you a sense of how freaked out people are about Lynn, people, has everyone here ever, has people here ever seen the New York Post? Yeah. New York Post, I know you've seen it, Amy. This is this tabloid in New York. You know, it's really a rag. It's a daily newspaper, but I mean it's.
It's like if Jerry Springer had a paper.
Yeah, right. Kind of like that. Anyway, it's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's this, you know, this Brit. He's actually from Australia, but he's a Brit. He's part of the British takeover of the American media. Anyway, they ran an editorial on New Year's Eve, right? Wednesday. 2 days ago. They ran an editorial entitled "The Return of Ramsey Clark," in which they describe Ramsey Clark as, quote, a legal 911 for a tawdry collection of accused terrorists and neo-Nazis. And then they go on to say, since the dawn of this decade, Clark, this is the editorial, Clark has become the lead counsel and leading apologist for conspiracist Lyndon LaRouche, who believes Elizabeth II is the queen pin of a worldwide drug smuggling cartel. In a speech in June 1990, Clark painted LaRouche as a civil rights martyr, ignoring the well-documented charges of LaRouche's anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism. And then it goes on from there. And then it concludes by saying, the fact that this slimy has-been is still walking around a free man tells you all you need to know about the United States, a country Ramsey Clark hates and wishes to destroy. So this is pretty vicious editorial. You know, but this gives you a sense of, you know, how freaked out these people are. They are freaked out. They are freaked out about what is going on, and they are freaked out about the fact that people are listening to Lynn. We just got to organize like hell. So I think I'll stop right there and see if people have questions, comments, discussion.
Very good presentation.
Oh, come on, folks. Someone's got something to say. Elizabeth, you must have something to say.
Too much to comprehend.
Oh, it's not too much. Not too much to comprehend.
Ban the bomb, huh?
And the bomb.
That was the origin of the so-called peace symbol. It's Dirty Birdie who brought that forth, an ancient symbol for death, called the ban the bomb symbol.
Well, one of the weird things about Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells, particularly Russell, but also Wells, is they've gone down in history as peaceniks and progressives.
Good and noble men.
Good and noble men. Even H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is generally seen as a social reformer and a liberal in the history books. This is a guy who supported Malthusianism, supported eugenics, you know, called for nuclear terror to get countries to surrender their sovereignty. And he's come down in history as a great progressive and
Briefcase balls.
And Russell is this, kind of like the saint of the peace movement, Guy who advocated preemptive nuclear strike on Russia in 1945.
Were they knighted? Do you know?
I don't know if Wells wasn't knighted. I don't know if Russell was or not.
Well, he was a
He was a
lord.
lord.
He
Russell
was
Yes,
a
he
lord,
was.
and he gave up his title
Okay.
as a lord, to achieve the idea of continuing empire through a different means.
So
Yeah,
if
now
we're going
we've
to think
got
he was just a regular
Just a
guy.
regular guy.
Sir Colin Powell and Sir Henry.
Well, Russell, unlike Wells, was kind of like a guy who was brought up from the middle class.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Russell was an aristocrat.
yeah.
His father had been
John
Russell, I think had been,
He was a prime minister.
Prime minister. I think his grandfather was a prime minister.
yeah. I mean, Russell was an aristocrat from the House of Lords, going back a number of generations. Got it all, Mike? Got anything?
So what's going to pop next?
What's going to pop next? Well, look,
the bird at the
the
tree.
rallying cry is, I don't know if everyone recalls it or not, but we had a conference in February of last year, 11 months ago, at which LaRouche issued the rallying cry of annihilate the IMF. Right? That was in February of last year, in case you've forgotten. And now, 11 months, when he said that, there were some people, I'm sure, who agreed, but it was certainly not something which was on the mind. It was something which was not at center stage politically. Well, now it's at center stage politically. The the issue of the IMF and the very continued existence of the International Monetary Fund is very much at center stage. So we are there. We are at that point. So we have a lot of things on tap. Look, one thing people should do is, I would recommend, and we can give the number out because after Sheila called me, I got it and put it on my Rolodex. We can give out the number to the White House comment line. People should call it. And, see that we have this, sometimes we ask people to write letters to Clinton or to call the White House. This is not a once-in-a-lifetime thing, folks. You can call the White House every week, or write them a letter every week. And there's no reason not to do that. Now, maybe once a week is a little much. Well, phone call. Well, these aren't toll-free numbers, so, maybe you can call from work or something. You could, it's not something just do once and say, well, in 1983 I called. So
I called the SDI and
people can call the White House and call them up congratulating Robert Rubin for refusing to go along with the government bailout of the private creditors, the private investors in South Korea. And then you can add something like, now's the time. Now the next step is to bring Lyndon LaRouche in so we could put together a new monetary system to replace the IMF. But, I would recommend people do that. Can you get my Rolodex? It's on my desk.
By the way, the operator doesn't argue with you at all.
No. They just take messages.
Yeah,
You can
right.
call up and say, Bill Clinton, had sex with a goat, and I'm outraged by it. And they'll just say, oh, thank you very much. I'm not kidding. They don't care what you say.
They do take note.
The White House comment line is, I don't know if people have a pen or pencil, but I'll give it to you. And then if anyone wants to get it after the meeting, but if you've got a pen or pencil right now, it's 202. Wait for Mike. 456 1414.
Oh, it's also 1111.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it 456?
Yeah, 456
It is 456. That's what
All right,
that's fine.
then put 1111.
4 ones after the 4.
All right, 202 456 1111.
Do they have an email?
Yeah, they do. It's president at whitehouse.gov. All small letters. That's president, President, at, with that little sign, White House, one word, WHITEHOUSE .gov. That's the email of the White House.
Saturate the email.
Email, faxes, phone calls. Call them up, say, I'm contacting you because I want to congratulate you. I want to congratulate the administration for the remarks by Treasury Secretary Rubin refusing to bail out the private investors in South Korea. Right? And the next step, bring in Lyndon LaRouche.
His name is Robert Rubin?
Robert Rubin. Robert Rubin.
I don't latest paper has.
He's got his
George
picture
Rubin.
too, we could, pin up the picture when you call him.
Right. This is the lead story, by the way, I think, in the New Federalist.
Yeah, it is.
It's the lead story. We just got a New Federalist in 2 days. This is brand new. So, I don't know.
May I
Yeah.
ask a question? I was walking by somebody's radio the other day at work, and I heard a little bit of news, something about there a proposal for an investigation into the death of Ron Brown. Have you heard of?
That's been boiling a little bit.
Yeah,
I haven't
yeah.
seen anything about it really.
Yeah,
Lynn's EIR has a little thing that talks about, there's some rumor that one of the people who found Ron Brown's body, that there was a bullet hole in his head. And, well, and anyway, apparently the so-called military person was not anywhere near his body, and the other person, that was, said it's not the case. This is just a fabrication that's being used.
You just had a brain hemorrhage like FDR did.
Oh, yeah, yeah, get one there. Thank you. 5-1, so pretty good.
32 caliber brain hemorrhage.
One thing I do know is that, you know, the take I've got on that, and I'm trying to remember the details, and I just can't quite recall, but is that, if I'm not mistaken, is that this is basically being aimed at Clinton. In other words,
Yeah,
this
that's
is not a defense
Yeah.
No.
that Clinton's, because Ron Brown was very close to Clinton. They worked very closely together. This is not a defense of the Clinton administration from the standpoint of trying to find out what happened to Ron Brown, but more that this is another thing aimed at Clinton from the standpoint of, oh, something else they're covering up.
And not something going along with the idea that Clinton was overriding UN policy in Bosnia.
Right,
and
right.
trying to get.
And I think some of these people, like Maxine Waters, have gotten sucked into this.
Yeah,
You know.
probably.
Some of these people. So it's not a, from what I could tell, it's not good.
Not a positive.
Not positive,
thing.
no.
Okay.
How would you get their air crew on the airplane to commit suicide?
Yeah,
First they shoot Ron Brown in the head,
Yeah,
and then they crash their plane into the ground. You know, doesn't make a lot of
Right
sense.
in the mountainside.
Right.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any, Islamic Jihad pilots, in the U.S. Air Force who are ready to commit suicide in order to enter
Maybe they were British.
paradise.
Maybe they were British Islamic Jihad.
Think for themselves.
Right. I think so.
Big help sometimes.
One of the benefits of having, baby boomers and Generation Xers, when you're trying to get them to commit suicide in order to do something like that, the idea of dying for your country is not such a big idea these days.
Think what you can do for your country.
I mean, what I heard the general say one time, he said, just dying for your country was a damn waste. He said, just your job is to make the other guy die for his.
That was Patton. That was Patton. That was in Patton's famous speech where
Well,
he
he
said
probably
that.
heard it himself right there in
Yeah.
the spot.
You ever seen the guy?
Patton?
Yeah.
No, I wasn't. I was born in 1950.
Oh, that's right.
Not that old. But Patton has this famous speech that's been printed, which what's his name? George C. Scott gives in the movie, except they had to tone it down in the movie because they didn't want an X rating, But anyway, Patton gives this it's his famous speech that he gave, and it was in that speech he said, some people will tell you that, your job is to die for your country, and I want to tell you that that's bull crap, Your job is to make the other poor sucker die for his country.
Say poor sucker.
Right.
He was in Patton's army then.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah?
he was. He was out
Well, maybe you heard it, I don't know.
Yeah, he knows how to.
That other bastard died for his country.
You were there, right, Bob?
You're the water boy.
Weren't you 20 years old that time?
Yeah, right.
Gengar, whatever.
So,
If you ever get him on the road.
well, I don't know, is there any more?
They'll never let them stop. He said they have to stop to organize.
Yeah.
If they can't organize, they can't fight.
I have an ongoing argument with a man at work.
Shh, 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 shh.
With a man at work. He's a big European traveler. He loves to go to Europe every summer, and he's always talking about how liberal the Dutch is and the Dutch are, and how wonderful their society is, and I keep telling him, this is an ongoing social experiment in genocide, this thing with the free drugs for the people who are addicted, and they have a special park to go to. I said, when one of them overdoses, they don't come right away with the ambulance and the emergency medical treatment. They let him stay there and seize or go into respiratory arrest. I said, it is not a wonderful society. It's an ongoing genocidal experiment, and I'm kind of getting him around to seeing that.
Well, look, if H.G. Wells could have envisioned the model neo-Malthusian sexual paradise, erotic paradise, zero growth society with no idea of the value of a human being or Republican institutions, if he could have envisioned this in 1901 perfectly, it would be Amsterdam and Holland today. I mean, this is a disgusting society, Dutch society. Disgusting.
I agree.
I mean, you know, you go there, I've been in Amsterdam, and people are nice, you know, it's you know, but there's something, you talk to people, there's no morality of any kind. Drugs, euthanasia, kill the old people, you know, there's nothing. It's like you're talking to empty people, you know. Anything, it's you know, you think of Haight-Ashbury in the 60s, you know. If it feels good, do it. You know, different strokes for different folks. You know, victimless crimes, you know. You know, you can do anything you want as long as you don't hurt another person. Of course, euthanasia, you know, that's... But, you know, this idea, you know, this whole Haight-Ashbury thing is like the philosophy of Holland today. It's horrible. It's really a horrible place. You know? So, I mean, I don't know what, you know, I mean, what can you say to someone who defends Dutch society that, you know?
Well, he only sees it from a tourist point of view.
Well, they have beautiful canals and museums, and
Got nice cheese.
it looks beautiful, like all these European cities look beautiful.
I don't know what his
Heineken beer.
perspectives are, but I finally got him to admit that, well, yes, maybe this is not a good thing, you know, that they do this with this.
Yeah, the euthanasia, I mean, you know, in Holland, you know, they're not just, you know, pulling the plug on people who have a
No,
month
they're
to live.
injecting them with overdoses.
They're injecting people and killing them. Like, basically, Dr. Kevorkian they've gone beyond Kevorkian, because in Kevorkian only kills people who ask him to kill them, right?
It's without their knowledge.
Without their
consent,
knowledge,
or
without their
their
consent,
families'
they're just
knowledge
killing
and
people.
consent,
And this is now part of the Dutch health system. Now, the last time that happened was in Nazi Germany, right? And that's now the law in Holland. So it's you know, you know, and the drugs, you know, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's a terrible place.
Yeah. So, well, anyway, I got him finally to agree with me after several discussions.
And Holland was used for years as the main drug transshipment point into all of the rest of Europe. In other words, the heroin, the cocaine, the hashish, you know, the methamphetamines would all come into Holland, and then from there be distributed to Germany and France and elsewhere, right? So, it's not, you know, it's a bad place.
It's oogie.
Were you going to ask something, Ned? Did you have a comment? If not, I thought
My question is, with any success in illustrating the bankruptcy of the international system against what the current population sees here, particularly in the Bay Area in California, and Oakland now claiming a big surprise in their tax revenue because their economy is doing so good, and that's what they all see or say. And
tell it to the people at East Oakland.
I understand that. Just if there's been any breakthrough or any way to communicate with these folks.
Well, look, let's be very clear about this. The only thing that's going to wake up most people is a gigantic shock. You know, that's just a fact. You know, that is a fact. Mm-hmm. You know, well, there's two things to keep in mind. First of all, the only thing that's going to wake up most people is a shock. People are not going to act unless their axioms and illusions are either shattered or threatened in such a way that they're getting very nervous, right? And without that, the vast majority of people aren't going to do anything. That's just a fact of life, you know?